All right, there we go. So happy Halloween. So we were just talking before the session about whether things change a bit when you start recording, which is actually really nice for a talk on ethics and technology. Because the question that we often think about in technology and ethics is what happens when you introduce a particular technology into a situation. So you could say, how does recording come into a classroom? How does that change the ethics of how someone giving a talk interacts with students? So, for fun, let's just jump ahead and let's jump right into this. Okay? And then we'll work our way back to more of an introduction for this class. I'll send these slides to Kim along with last week's because I realize now I'm very embarrassed I didn't send you last week's slides, but I'll send you both in the package to Kim and send them to you. So have you guys seen this before? This is something you've talked about in some of your other sessions? No. So this is like what's known as like the tetrad, and it comes from Marshall McLuhan and his work around technology. Marshall McLuhan, famous Canadian philosopher of technology, and actually in his time he wasn't just famous in academic circles, he was also famous in the public sphere. So you turned on the TV, you actually hear him talking about the impacts of technologies on society. And there's certain phrases that are often associated with him, so quotes. So have you heard of the phrase like, the medium is the message? That's a Marshall McLuhan phrase, right? And what he's trying to say is, it's not what you watch on TV in the sense of, you know, what's being said by maybe an actor or a newscaster that shapes your experience of reality or how the world is disclosed. It's rather the medium in and of itself. So the medium that could be, broadcasting technologies, right? That allowed suddenly the same program to be sent across the country. And the reason I like to sometimes begin by talking about McLuhan and his tetrad is it introduces a way to think about technologies just a little bit more deeply. And my sense is that if you can think about technologies a little bit more deeply, then you may start to have certain noticings and you may start to ask certain questions you wouldn't otherwise ask about the ethics of a technology. So the tetrad is basically saying that technologies mediate or have their effects on their world in 4 different ways. And we can think about those 4 different ways in categorical terms. So one is a technology will tend to enhance something, right? It tends to amplify something. On the other hand, it makes something else obsolete. When a technology is pushed to the limit, it reverses into something else. And the opposite, there's something that the technology brings back. Okay. So we could think about a technology like, a recorder in the classroom, right? Whereby this talk is currently being recorded and put onto YouTube. Is that right? You're streaming it? So what does it amplify? What does this enhance? Right? This kind of technology. You guys have that? I'll get us started, and then you're going to help me with the next technology, okay? So you could say it enhances the classroom, or the space of the classroom. But because the classroom is no longer confined to just this one physical space where we are together, it now enhances it, whereby what we say, the conversation that we have in this classroom, now appears somewhere else. Right? When you start to think about it, then you say, well, there's some interesting ethics there. Right? What happens there? Can you think of anything else that enhances? Okay. Yeah.
Healthcare.
Okay.
So like if you go back maybe 100 years ago, x-rays and all those ultrasounds, you wouldn't have been available. And now they do, and you have practitioners to get a better look at what's happening inside of you.
Yeah, for
what's
sure.
going on.
So that would be an example you could say of how an X-ray, what does it enhance, right? But specifically for this, let's just push it to the limit. What does this technology of streaming a classroom enhance? Do you know what I mean? Let's focus on that one technology.
Accessibility.
Accessibility, perfect. So it enhances access, right? Now you don't have to pay tuition to attend a university course. Right? It's freely available online. So what does it make obsolete?
Coming to class.
Perfect. So it obsolesces attendance, right? What else does it make obsolete? Tuition, right? Don't have to pay for tuition anymore.
Are you sure about that?
Well, if, unless you want a degree,
Yeah.
right? What else does it make obsolete? It makes obsolete, you could say note-taking, right? Even if I decide not to pay attention, I can always look at the recording later. So you could say, in a way, it obsoletes or obsolesces a certain kinds of presence. Because you could be in a class and suddenly decide, oh, I'm gonna check my email. No big deal, I can always log on later. Right? What does it retrieve?
Information. So you can always come back on it
Okay.
if you didn't catch anything.
Okay. So that would be just the way that McLuhan, I think the way he would say, what does it retrieve, is he might say it retrieves something like the cameraman. So like something from the past. It retrieves that a classroom now becomes, or could become, like a pillar presentation, where you're no longer engaged in the classroom, but for some reason the camera's all on me compared to the space of the classroom. Right? So it's almost like what technologies or what ways of being are retrieved or brought back by this technology. Editing, right? Suddenly, if I made a mistake in this class, I could say, Kim, can you just, take out that little part? Right? So it also kind of, you could say, it brings back, post-production editing, you could say. Then the last question, which becomes harder, what happens when you push it to the limit? Right? So when you push this, what do you risk the technology now becoming?
So we see like a handful of people providing the most amount of information.
For sure.
And a lot of people will not get a voice, depending on the content.
So in a way you could say when something like, virtual classrooms are pushed to their limit, they might actually push out the conventional or traditional university institution. Because if you amplify one person's voice, a class in ethics and technology, well, this no longer has to be offered somewhere else. Right? It might, when pushed to the limit, it might get rid of synchronous learning because everything becomes asynchronous. It's funny, I do some teaching for the nursing faculty, and one of the instructors who teaches there, she's very happy every year to say, hey Michael, can I use my recording of the presentation you gave last year again this year? Right? And in a way, you see what does it actually reverse into? It's no longer, you could say, become a classroom presentation. Now you might say, so why are we doing this about, classroom presentation? Well, some people will say that, large language model-based chat boxes and technologies are the most transformative of technologies of, the year 2020 to 2024. That when we look back on history, this will be a pivotal moment as these technologies are coming into existence. Okay? So we need to think about the ethics of it, right? Because we should be able to think critically about any technology that comes into a space, whether it's a healthcare space, right? Or whether it's some other institution or environment. So help me out with this. What would you say ChatGPT, what does it amplify? What does it enhance? Because you guys have talked about ChatGPT in one of your classes, right? Ken, did you guys talk about it?
Yeah, we have.
Yeah.
yeah.
So you, and I'm assuming you guys have all used it before, right? You know, to write your term papers and stuff like that, right? I'm just joking.
Well, I guess it amplifies information retrieval,
Okay.
because you can do it faster, and like general information that you would have to go out and look for is just fed to you if you just ask it a quick question.
So what does it amplify? It amplifies, you could say, the speed at which,
Yeah.
you know, text can be read or sorted through, right? For sure, right? Can you think of anything else it amplifies?
Say speed.
Yeah, speed. And I think when you start thinking about the word speed, what you'd probably hear some people say is it actually amplifies or enhances efficiency, right? Because you can suddenly do more in that period of time, right? It's not simply that it's just one task is done, it does something more. So some people might also say it enhances productivity, right? What did I put down? Processing of text, right? So the way I think of ChatGPT is, you know, essentially here you have this sophisticated algorithm, right? That's been developed from a period of training, right? So essentially it can sift through huge amounts of text and essentially predict text that should follow from other text, right? So pattern recognition, speed of text analysis, you could say automation, productivity, so you said all that. So what does it make obsolete? Yeah.
Using your brain.
Using your brain? Okay. Help me out here.
So let's say you have a term paper you want to write.
Yeah.
You don't really want to put effort into thinking about the paper, so you just tell ChatGPT, hey, can you write me a paper on this and this topic?
Yeah.
And then it'll just spit it out for you.
I like that. So it obsolesces, you know, work. You could say it obsolesces writer's block, right? It obsolesces potential struggle. Oh, I don't know where even to start with this paper. Compared to now, ChatGPT would give you an introductory paragraph, maybe an outline, right, for how you might structure it, right? What else does it make obsolete?
Like literature review, you don't have to read through everything to get an idea.
Perfect. So, you know, although it is a text-based technology, right, whereby you interact with it by chatting, by typing into it and texting back, something that it does or it makes obsolete is reading, right? You don't technically have to go through Google and use a search engine to find all these different texts, right? You don't have to go to the library, the physical library necessarily, and go through textbooks, right? Because you're trusting that, you know, this program was trained on all these texts that came before whatever year the current version was released, right? So what I have, reading of larger texts, searching for content, right? So what happens, what does it kind of bring back? Yeah, what's being retrieved by ChatGPT?
Commanding,
Pardon me?
like you learn how to do commands better, like learn how to ask.
That's a nice, I would say that too. So it brings back a different kind of thinking, right? It almost brings back like a dialogue-based way of reading, right? Do you remember those Choose Your Own Adventure books? Remember years ago it was like go to page 13 if you say yes, or go to page 23 if you say no. That's a different way of reading. It's not linear, right? And this is something even different from that. If you're trying to make sense of something, you're now making sense of it through an interaction with a chatbot, right? Does it bring back anything else? So in a way, you could say it brings back trial and error probabilistic writing, right? You've heard of like the phenomenon from like OpenAI of like hallucinations, where every now and then you might get some garbled text that doesn't really make sense, okay? Because the program in a way operates by a probability function. Right? Understanding through dialogue, that's what we talked about already. What does it also bring back? Anything that was contained in the source texts that were used to train it. So certain biases. And you could also say it brings back plagiarism as a notion, right? Because whose work is it, right? When you're using ChatGPT.
I could also say it brings back fact checking, because sometimes you ask it a question, it will get it wrong.
Yeah.
So you kind of have to like look it over and do this research on your own again, which kind of defeats the whole purpose.
Totally. So then you can say, what happens when it's pushed to its limit, right? So on the one hand, you could say it could break down, whereby essentially it doesn't give you trustworthy information. But ultimately something that does happen is whatever it generates is based in part on the texts that it read, right? And by read, I don't mean reading in the sense of sense making, because you have to differentiate how ChatGPT works compared to how you read something, right? When you experience the world, you might say, I walk into the room and I see this, this, and this, right? But if you were to say to ChatGPT, write a dialogue of what you see when you enter a classroom, it's not doing it based on that experience, it's rather doing it based on a reading of source texts, right? Like what things are normally found in the classroom. So what it can reverse into is actually unoriginal content. Right? You could say almost like a common sense, or the risk of homogeneous content. So there are some people who've written about, a worry with ChatGPT is that we will lose some kind of originality in thinking. Right? So the reason for introducing Marshall McLuhan is not just because I'm a Marshall McLuhan fan. Honestly, if you have some free time and you get tired of interacting with ChatGPT, read some of his books. They're actually extremely accessible. And some of them are also just written in an aesthetically nice way, like his book on probes, right? Which are almost like a series of just thoughtful quotes that can be interpreted in different ways. But what I'm trying to do, and I'm hoping a product of this class is, or an objective or an outcome of this class, is that you think about technologies critically. And both everyday technologies, meaning the ones that we don't even think about anymore. So I imagine at this point in your life, you don't think about what are the ethics of having an iPhone, right? And how that changes my being in the world. You probably don't think of the ethics of social media anymore. Although we thought about them a great deal when they first came into existence, and we think about them when things go wrong, right? But you also think of technologies critically when it comes to emerging technologies. Right? So emerging technology for me is something like ChatGPT. I'm really curious to see what the next version is like, right? And other technologies that are based on that particular style or way of training. And then also these imagined future technologies, right? That's also important to do. Something like the tetrad is useful, I said, because it starts to expand our thinking about a technology, right? The depth in which we think of something, or the complexity in which we think of a technology. So ultimately, we can begin to ask these questions, which I think all have an ethical sense to them. So what role do technologies have in our lives? How do we evaluate technologies? Now, evaluate meaning what makes a particular technology a good technology compared to a bad technology? Do technologies in and of themselves have value, or is it in the user? What properties must technology have if it is to be an object of moral concern? If I am to have any obligations with respect to it? Meaning we talk about throwaway technologies. I don't think many people think very hard about throwing away a paper bag that's going to be broken down in the environment, okay? But do you think differently about, I don't know, technologies that you form an attachment to in a particular way, right? You know, a teddy bear, for example, that's an example of a technology. What kind of technological world do we want to live in? Want, you know, I'm hoping you recognize this now introduces some notion of value, because generally we want something that serves some purpose that we see as valuable, or achieves some end that we see as valuable. We talked about this a bit yesterday. Do machines have the capacity for moral consciousness, whatever that might mean when we talk about consciousness? And if we think about ourselves as technological beings, what kind of humans do we want to become? So my take-home points last week, Thursday, was ethics is always already present in our day-to-day interactions. The ethical questions ask what's going on, to which I must now respond. Talking about what constitutes moral consciousness. How varying moral perspectives can locate morality differently. And how reflection and discussion can support moral actions. For this week, all of those objectives, those take-home points, we're going to take a technological focus to. So by saying that technologies are constitutive of our very being in the world. Right? The techno-ethical question asks, how does a technology weave into human life, affecting our perception, decisions, and actions? Right? So if we wanted to ask an ethical question about ChatGPT, how does ChatGPT weave into, you know, classroom practices or learning practices as a student? Right? How does it affect our perception of the world, our understanding of history, right, of texts, of knowledge, right? Techniques constitutes our own moral consciousness. So if you recognize that moral consciousness reflects our embodiment in the world, if we embody technologies, then technologies therefore have an impact on our consciousness. And we're also going to talk about how different moral perspectives can be codified into technologies. So, let's get started with the first one. Maybe I'll just stop. Is this making sense to you both? Am I jumping anywhere radical? You can totally call me on it even if a camera's on.
So far, so good.
So, I talked to you guys before. I work in the NICU, right? I'm a physician. I'm not a philosopher. But when I went into practice as a physician, and probably was sometime during residency in pediatrics, I started to become really interested in ethical questions and situations. And so that's why I decided to go into graduate studies and do a PhD at the same time. And I attended this fabulous course by Catherine Adams in Department of Secondary Education. She still teaches that class, which deals with pedagogy and technology. Okay. And one of the things that she introduced was philosophy of technology, and I think she introduced it in a really accessible way. So I'm drawing on that course for you guys here. And I can, if you're interested in this topic after, I can also give you some different textbooks or names of books that you can go, knowing that textbooks are often dated with respect to what's going on right now, but that doesn't necessarily mean a certain style of thinking can be particularly helpful in looking at a contemporary issue. So philosophy of technology as a discipline would ask questions like, what role do things play in our technological culture? Should we assign agency or responsibility to technologies themselves? What effects do things have on us? And how do technologies constitute our humanity? As a series of traditions, philosophy of technology often identifies, you could say, three kind of happenings in history whereby technology came to the forefront. and they came to the forefront in a particular way in the broader field of philosophy or other critical disciplines that respond to questions like, how ought I to live? Right? One way is looking at technologies purely as an instrument. So what would be an example of an instrumental perspective of technology? Guns don't kill people, people kill people. It's just a thing, right? It doesn't have any effect on the way that I interact with others. I can put down a technology at any point, and I will be unchanged, and the situation itself will be unchanged, because it's just a tool. The problem with this perspective is it's relatively naive, right? And my sense is the moment you look at any technology in a critical way, you begin to realize just how much it shapes the world around us, right? Just think about the technologies around you right now, right? What technologies do you see? Computer, good.
Projection.
Projector, yeah.
Camera.
Wi-Fi.
Pardon me?
Wi-Fi.
Wi-Fi, okay, what else?
Does furniture count as technology?
Sure.
Lights.
Lights, sure. Is it cold in here?
The thermostat.
Sure. Thermostat, heating, perfect.
Is that noise cancelling foam?
Yeah, some kind of diffusers for sound to prevent like reflections, right?
The sprinklers.
Sprinklers, perfect. Your coffee cup, right? Your jewelry, your clothes, my glasses. The fact that somehow I have no hair, no, that's not technology, but even how we appear is structured by technologies, right? Is there anything in this room that isn't a technology?
The people? Are we technology? No.
Are you sure?
Are we?
How did you come into this world? Did your parents just happen to randomly meet, or was there any technology that brought together, how they met, right? I'm not saying your parents met on Tinder or something like that.
Like a bus.
Yeah. Some people might even say things like marriage is a form of technology. It's like a technological agreement, right, that brings and keeps people together. Right? Institutions are technologies in a way. If any of us take medications, right, can we really say that our body is wholly natural compared to one that's also impacted by technologies? The fact I had a cup of coffee to try and wake myself up a little bit more right before coming to you guys here, that's a technology, right? So there are very few things in our world. And the problem is we don't tend to think about all of these technologies as tools, right? Or at least the word tools doesn't really disclose the technologies in the full way in which they affect our living. So that's why an instrumental perspective of technology is relatively naive. So what came next in kind of philosophy of technology was like these singular transcendental perspectives, right? This would be expressed in a phrase like, all technology is bad, right? But the problem with a singular perspective of technology is you pass over the ways in which different technologies differ in the way that they affect us and our world and society, right? Because one of you said the whiteboard, I think, or the chair, or the table, is that a technology, right? Well, it's a very different kind of technology compared to a laptop, right? Compared to a large language processing model like ChatGPT. So a singular transcendental perspective that often tends to either, overly romanticize a world free of technologies. Technologies, are the source of all evil, or one that, you know, overly romanticizes that technology is going to save us as a humanity, is also rather problematic. So really that's led us to where we are now, which is an empirical turn when it comes to thinking about technology. Meaning we don't really think about technology, we think about technologies, recognizing each technology is different. I already gave you one example of kind of a way of opening up some reflection on a technology, right? McLuhan's tetrad as one possible way. Let me give you a couple more ways. So, have you guys heard of the term phenomenology? So phenomenology is a movement in continental philosophy, begun with such philosophers as Husserl, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, Levinas. Ringing any bells? Not so much. Okay. Big time philosophers. Right? And you could say that phenomenology as a tradition in philosophy is actually relatively heterogeneous, meaning there are many different philosophers who come under that banner. And there's actually very little unity within that broader field. On the other hand, you can say that phenomenology expresses some kind of a common concern. And the common concern it deals with is meaning, in the sense of how it is that meaning arises as we experience something. So when I walk into this room, I don't experience, you know, a busying blur of orange and gray and light, right? Somehow I have a sense of a classroom, right? I experience something in that moment. So Don Heide is an American philosopher who belongs to this tradition of phenomenology. And he basically would say that if phenomenology is interested in consciousness, meaning the way we directly experience the world, right? The way you're experiencing this world right now, right? Something we need to realize or orient to is that our consciousness is mediated by technologies. But different technologies mediate the world or interact with us in the world in a different way. So he uses terms like embodiment, hermeneutic, alterity, background, right? To point to different ways that technologies we can interact with. So you might say, you know, the typical example for post-phenomenology for embodiment would be something like a hammer as a technology. When I pick up the hammer, I embody it. What does it mean to say I embody a technology? When I'm using a hammer, I'm no longer thinking of holding it. I rather simply, my arm, my body becomes the hammer, and I adopt a hammering way of being in the world. The only time I actually notice or think about the fact I'm holding a hammer would be if I miss the nail, or if I'm somehow inexperienced in using a particular technology. Right? So through learning, you could say you embody a technology to the point it becomes transparent. Right? Think about driving a car. When you were first learning to drive a car, you were probably thinking, all right, where do I hold my hands? Right? All right, if you're driving a standard, you know, trying to shift and adjust the clutch and everything else at the same time, right? Which foot goes on like the brake and the gas, right? You're thinking about it. But over time, you no longer think about driving a car, you're just embodying it. And if suddenly someone comes from the lane on your right and swerves into you, you don't experience it like, oh, they're about to hit my car. What you experience is they're about to hit me, right? You have that feeling of, right? Because you're embodying that technology. Okay? Compared to those technologies which we interact in a hermeneutic way, right? So the thermostat is a classic example. I don't embody a thermostat. When I walk over to the thermostat and I look at it, it actually shows me the world in a particular way. It interprets it for me, right? I read it as an instrument. Compared to one that I encounter as an other, an alterity relationship, right? So here we could think of something like ChatGPT. The phenomenology of ChatGPT, if it's working well, that you'll forget you're interacting with an algorithm, right? You'll interact in a chat, or you have an experience of chatting, right? Have you ever had an issue where you're trying to get some help from something on a website and you have to use one of those chat boxes, right? Oh, where's my UPS delivery? And you log on and then you have to, you're like, oh, I'm not actually chatting with a person, I'm chatting with, right? That's not working well, right? You're not actually experiencing an alterity relation. Compared to technologies that are situated in the background, that we don't even think about. You could say we don't even encounter them, but they change the nature of our world, right? So the example is the lights. You probably don't think about whether it's bright or dark in here unless it's too bright or too dark. You don't think of the fact that we have central heating here unless you're too hot or too cold, right? It's simply in the background. So for Don Idy, when it comes to thinking about ethics, we need to recognize that many technologies we encounter in a variety of ways, and we often encounter them in a pre-reflective sense. And what do I mean by that? We don't think about it, we just are interacting them. So when you walked into the room today, you didn't think about your experience of sitting on a chair or sitting at a table or how you were interacting with a computer or how you're interacting with your cup. You just care about yourself in the world. But we have ethical concerns when we realize that some of these technologies change the way it's interacting with someone other to ourselves. So this is a picture of the NICU where I work, right? Well, Alex. Right? Here are two parents reaching into an isolette to touch their newborn baby. Okay? And you could say, well, how is it that something like the incubator mediates the relation of parent and child? Right? How is it that their child is made visible, present to them, on display, yet also this technology structures a certain kind of relationship? The parents can't simply reach in and hold their baby, right? They have to kind of reach in portholes, always standing at a distance. There's also an ethics to this technology, right? You can see this is a sophisticated incubator, right? About $20,000, right? So I can press a button on the floor and I can cause it to lower down to the level of the mom who's just had a C-section or something, so she can touch her child, right? But there's many parts of the world where they don't have such incubators, right? So someone who can't stand up can't touch their child, right? Are you starting to notice different ethics or equity kind of notices here? So when we think about the sphere of health, right? There are those mundane technologies like a stethoscope. When you pick it up, you embody it. If you know how it works, you're no longer thinking about, you're listening to the heart, right? And it presents the child as a heart. Right? There are hermeneutic technologies, like an X-ray or some kind of imaging technology, right? It presents a child in a particular way, right? Sometimes you might say, well, you know, is this even ethical? Is there a big issue here? Well, think about what happens when a mom comes in for her first prenatal appointment and an ultrasound is done and it shows a fetus as an individuated being from her, right? You know, anti-choice societies are very good about knowing the phenomenology of ultrasound, right? They will show images of fetuses as separate beings, essentially making the mother completely invisible, taking her out of the picture, to say we have to, do everything we can for this life, right? I talked about a technology that you can encounter as an alterity, or, like a screen, whether you can touch your baby or not, what it will disturb, and also those in the background. Right? So have I convinced you for the most part about this first point? Technologies are constitutive of our very being in the world. Yeah, good enough? Okay. All right, how does a technology weave into human life affecting our perception? All right, it's 2:46. We have until what time today? 3:15?
3:20.
3:20? Okay. I'm going to show you the tiniest bit of a video, and I'm going to cut it off because, we don't need to go late, right? Then they'd be bad. So let's see if this works.
Un jour, Zeus a dit à Prométhée, le temps est venu pour toi, pour nous les dieux, de faire venir au jour les non-immortels. Les non-immortels, ce sont les animaux, les hommes. Or, Prométhée, qui est chargé de faire ce travail, a un frère. Ce frère, c'est son jumeau, il s'appelle Épiméthée. Ce frère Épiméthée, il a pour caractéristique d'être le frère jumeau de Prométhée. Il lui ressemble, il est tout à fait son double, mais il est de son contraire également. Épiméthée, c'est le dieu du défaut, de l'oubli. Prométhée, c'est celui du savoir, de la maîtrise absolue, de la mémoire totale. Prométhée n'oublie rien. Épiméthée oublie tout. Or, Épiméthée dit à son frère Prométhée, Zeus t'a chargé de faire quelque chose, je veux m'en occuper. C'est moi qui m'en occupe. Et comme Épiméthée, c'est le frère un peu simple d'esprit de Prométhée, Prométhée de l'affection pour son frère. Il n'ose pas refuser, il est d'accord, t'en occupe. Donc, Épiméthée va se mettre à distribuer les qualités. Il va donner, par exemple, à la gazelle la vitesse. La gazelle. Au lion, la force et l'endurance. À la tortue, la carapace, etc., etc. Bref, il va distribuer des qualités qui sont équilibrées. Ce que décrit la distribution des qualités par Épiméthée, c'est l'équilibre écologique de la nature. Le lion court après la gazelle, il mange la gazelle, mais comme les gazelles courent très vite, il y a toujours des gazelles qui se reproduisent que le lion n'attrape pas, et tout ça, tout va bien. Toutes les espèces sont équilibrées. Donc, Épiméthée distribue toutes les qualités, et puis d'un seul coup, il s'aperçoit qu'il regarde dans son panier, il n'y a plus de qualité. J'ai oublié de garder une qualité pour moi. Le panier est vide. Or, il me reste à faire venir au jour, comme dit le grec, l'homme, enfin le mortel. Il y avait encore une espèce à faire venir au jour, mais il n'y a plus de qualité pour lui donner une forme. Du coup, Prométhée est obligé d'aller dans l'Olympe, dans l'atelier d'Héphaïstos, voler le feu. Le feu qui est évidemment le symbole de la technique, mais qui est aussi le symbole de la puissance de Dieu, Zeus.
From the little bottle.
disant si nous voulons comprendre la question de la technique telle qu'elle se pose à nous aujourd'hui, les hommes du XXIe siècle, nous devons nous retourner vers la mythologie des Grecs anciens, pas simplement la philosophie, mais la mythologie tragique des Grecs anciens. Si j'ai pu dire cela, c'est parce que cette mythologie des Grecs anciens pose précisément correctement le problème. Dans les termes de la mythologie, bien sûr, et de la religion grecque primitive, de la religion tragique des Grecs. Mais il pose incroyablement la question comme elle doit être posée.
If you're interested in watching the whole thing, I'll send you the link later on. That's a portion of a small short film that was an interview of Bernard Stiegler, who's a French philosopher who passed away just over the past few years. I wanted to show you for a couple reasons. One, it always gives me a break from speaking, that's nice. The other thing is, if you have a chance to read any of Stiegler's writings at any point in your lifetime, some of it's very challenging, I'll be honest with you. Like, when it comes to reading philosophy, there's some stuff that you can pick up and just read while you're listening to some music. There's other stuff that you find yourself reading and having to reread, and they refer to other people, so you have to go back and read so-and-so, and like, it can be really hard to get into. But Stiegler is surprisingly accessible when he's interviewed, either in like interview kind of transcripts, or some of the videos that he's made. What he offers in this recounting of Prometheus and Epimetheus is not just a nice story, but a way of thinking about our relation to technologies as humans. Right? And for Stiegler, he would say, technologies are not external to our being, rather than are what makes us human, as we are realized as technical beings, forever constituted by and constituting technology. This means that as we create technologies, we are always recreating the sort of humans that we are or will become. So this idea of, the gazelle having the speed, right? The giraffe having the long neck, like these innate qualities that make animals who they are. The innate quality that makes us who we are is our prosthetic relationship to technology, our capacity to embody technologies, the fact that we are somehow deficient without it, and that we can't think of technologies as mere tools, but rather each technology that we utilize or create or otherwise design recreates the kind of people we are. Right? So for Stiegler, all technologies are deeply ethical, and all ethical questions are technological questions, you could say in one way or form. Does that make sense? So, when I think of my own lifetime, iPhones came about, in my, what was it, 10, 15 years ago now? Right? I would have been in my 20s, 30s, right?
2007?
Yeah. Have dramatically changed the way that people interact, right? It will be fascinating to see how does something like ChatGPT change the way that you interact with the knowledge base that is informative of the practice of medicine. Right? That's going to be huge. What's going to be the point of having you memorize anatomy in your lectures if something is going to be so readily at hand? So how will this change the nature of how we teach the practice of medicine? For engineers, right? They have so much power when it comes to practices within our society, because they're the ones who ultimately are involved in creating these different things. And so hopefully I've kind of addressed that second point. So the third one is that techniques constitute our own moral consciousness, as they constitute intersubjectivity, historicity, temporality, purpose, meaning, and freedom as constituent elements. So on Thursday, I talked about this notion of a moral experience as encompassing a person's sense that the values that they deem to be important are realized in their life, right? When you have that experience of something, that person cut me off in traffic, that was just wrong, right? That's a moral experience, right? When you've been patiently waiting, to have your question answered, and your hand's been up, which feels like 5 minutes, and then your neighbor just raises their hand, and then the instructor notices them and asks them first, right? That's a moral experience when somehow it doesn't sit right with you. So what I would say is that these different technologies that have been brought into play do change or shape the way that we're brought up, and do change or shape the way that we develop a moral sense, right? A good example of that right now is content, right? So you guys both seem so young. Do either of you have kids? No? When we were younger and had kids, and they were at that age, you could decide what programs they watched on TV. And you knew that programs that were on before 7 p.m. or 6 p.m. at nighttime were probably okay, right? But we don't have television like that anymore, right? Like television, by and large, most people watch using streaming services. There is no after 7 p.m. Right? Instead, we have notions of parental controls. All right, we're going to limit the amount of time, or only allow them to watch shows that, above a certain rating or below a certain rating. Okay, so we can have some control how media affects the way children are brought up. But let's go back to ChatGPT as an example. Where did all these texts come from that were used to train ChatGPT? What areas of the world?
Western.
Yeah, Western. Whatever that means, American, right? To a large extent, right? So in some way or form, we've trained this new technology to express or reflect American values, prejudices, and so forth, because that's what's contained in the source text. It's an English language, right? Thought. What does that mean as certain, laws come into place in the States that may not fit with Canadian culture, right? And those laws are written into the texts of American society, and they're processed by future generations of ChatGPT. Laws around women's rights, abortion, and so forth, right? Technologies have a way or a potential of affecting how we bring up our children and the kind of qualities that they recognize as being good or bad, right? And they also have the potential to just affect the way that we're interacting with each other on a daily basis. So this is now a really dated picture. I'm gonna have to update this whole presentation. This is back from summer, pre-COVID, legislature grounds. Can you recognize it? What the people are doing in this picture? This is a picture of the summer of Pokemon Go. Right? When people were going out for walks with their kids, everyone's head was looking down, trying to find these Pokemon. Right? Now, I don't know. I'm curious to see what this upcoming summer looks like when Apple releases their new VR set. Right? Creating opportunities for not just immersive experiences, but augmented experiences. How is that going to change the way in which we interact with one another in these social spaces? How is that going to change the way that parents are present to their kids? Right? Maybe it won't have a huge impact this year because there are affordability issues. But we all know as technologies are introduced, they tend to become more affordable with time. And what might have been introduced as a technology for gaming can suddenly find its way into other uses as well. And it doesn't seem like, you know, Apple's new VR set is any point limited to gaming. So I ask this question kind of every year I do this class. What technologies do you regard as most significant as shaping, influencing, changing, extending, or otherwise reconstructing our moral consciousness? Moral consciousness, that sense of what is right or wrong, or maybe you could even say our ethical being, that sense of interacting with others. Yeah.
Well, I guess this is an easy answer, but maybe like broadcasting.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think that's a great example. A great example from the past, for sure. Right? And I mean, these are some pictures of different examples of technologies which have had a huge impact on society, right? You know, everything, from anesthesia. Just the advent of anesthesia, how that changed the practice of medicine. Can you imagine what medicine was like before we were able to treat pain and engage in surgeries? Right? Different kind of technologies that allowed people to not spend their days foraging or otherwise consumed with activities involved in procuring food, right? Dramatically shifted our culture, right? Technologies of transportation, right? But, it's interesting, like on the one hand, there's value in studying past technologies and how they influenced or shaped our society. But what we always want to be able to do is also understand technologies as they're brought into play, right? So we can respond to them proactively. And different cultures you'll find in history have had different responses to technologies. All right, 304. Need to make sure we stick to time, all right? Many moral perspectives can be codified into technologies such that designers, engineers have moral ethical responsibilities. So when we talked about moral perspectives, we talked about things like deontology, consequentialism, right? Contractual ethics, right? Narrative ethics, right? So one example we can use of building, you could say, some kind of way of thinking about ethics or a way of thinking about what's right and what's wrong into a technology is this Langdon Winner's bridge. So Langdon Winner is a philosopher of technology who wrote about these bridges that were designed by Moses in the United States. And essentially what these bridges did is they lined various major roadways in the US. And if you notice what's kind of interesting about these bridges, they're not particularly aesthetically interesting, right? But they're relatively short, right? They don't have much clearance. I think you can get like an Audi under them, no problem, right? BMW sports car, right? But you would be hard pressed to get a bus to drive under a bridge like this, right? And so what was described about by Langdon Winner is that these bridges actually affected or had kind of a moral code written or built into them, all right? Because what they did is they limited transportation under this bridge to a class of people that didn't require the use of something like a bus, right? So you can imagine if you put a little bridge like this over all the roadways going down to the beaches, that would limit beach access, by and large, to people who are able to afford a car and travel down independently. Now you might say, is that morally right? Is that morally wrong? Okay? The point is, to recognize that this bridge actually can affect someone's moral outlook in the world, who should have access to this place. Does that make sense?
But like, isn't everything kind of also deciding who should have access? Like price for stuff?
For sure, right? So I mean, that's where, you know, what I'm asking you to do is to develop a critical eye, to look at any technology, right? And say, well, you know, how does this privilege a certain person, right? Okay. Look at where this university is built in Edmonton, right? Windsor Park, probably one of the most affluent neighborhoods in the city, beside Belgravia. You know, when I started as a physician, I couldn't afford to buy a house in Windsor Park or Belgravia, right? Okay, Garneau, still pretty high rent, right? So who benefits from having the university in this part of the town? Right? Now, true, anyone can get here, anyone can take the bus, but it certainly is easier if you're, you know, the child of someone who can afford to live in one of these neighborhoods right around it to get to class on time, right? To achieve in class if you have to spend less time in the car. Now, Edmonton's not a big deal, right? Like, we don't have a huge, everything's pretty much 20, 30, 45 minutes away. But you can imagine universities in, you know, certain cities that have a large kind of geographic spread with respect to potential students and how far they might have to travel each day. Another way of thinking or asking questions about technologies comes from the work of Bruno Latour. Bruno Latour is a philosopher who's associated with actor network theory, and honestly, the more I've learned about Bruno Latour, I feel bad giving this presentation because he's written about so much more than actor network theory as well. But the basic idea of actor network theory is that humans and technologies are enmeshed, bound up together in networks of, you know, different kinds of programs, ways of behaving. And if we want to understand those programs, those ways of behaving, we have to view both humans and technologies as constitutive parts. So the example that he uses is the example of the sleeping policeman, right? Where he would say the speed bumps that we install on roads are essentially functioning in a delegated capacity of a policeman, right? You know, rather than pay for a policeman to stand beside the road and say don't speed, we install the speed bumps, right? And so in some countries the word for a speed bump is the same as a sleeping policeman, right? Now these speed bumps do have an effect, have a moral program, because they're essentially telling you as a driver to slow down. Why? Not just because they want to make life more inconvenient, for it to take you longer to get where you're going, to potentially risk the undercarriage of your car by hitting these bumps. Have you ever hit a speed bump driving too fast? That feels horrible, huh? But you know what would feel worse is hitting a kid at that speed, right? So we appreciate as a society that there's something morally appropriate of slowing down in an area where children may be playing, right? So there's value of having these, right? Or where people may be walking like around a mall, right? But the point is that these express a certain notion of morality, right? There's some kind of principle underlying their design that is enacted by our relationship to them, how we interact with them. Does that make sense? You know, just to drive this point home, right? These are pictures of different kind of benches, right? Each of them, you can say, affects a particular way of regarding others, right? What's different about these 4 benches when you look at all 4 of them?
You can't sleep on them.
Exactly. Right? So the only one you can sleep on is probably the Edmonton bench, right? Why are they designed that way?
To keep the homeless from sleeping on it.
Exactly. Right? Because these benches aren't designed for everyone. You could say, well, sure, anyone can sit on them, but they're designed for a particular way, which as a society we've said is an appropriate way to use that thing. This was from Jasper Ave, right, during COVID. I don't know if they took these spikes down or not, but again, trying to prevent people from congregating around the bank, right? Knowing that might be a place that you can go to warm up in the wintertime. And it's usually a particular segment of society, people who may be houseless, right, who end up, using these benches. So when we see these different technologies, we do have to ask the question, what do our use and design of technologies say about us as people? And these are all ethical questions. Now I'm using examples from media ecology here, right? Everyday examples. But we should be able to also think of everyday healthcare examples as well, right? I gave you the example of the incubator, how it's designed, right? How it's designed to be able to go down in height to essentially afford an interaction between someone who's in a wheelchair. But not all healthcare technologies have that accessibility design into them. And sometimes when they do, it's by happenstance, right? Rather than from the perspective of trying to achieve a certain experience or a certain access to. So I'm hoping that my last point from this presentation is obvious. That reflection into different technologies, whether you choose to use a heuristic like the McLuhan tetrad, a way of looking at the world like post-phenomenology, a way of kind of theorizing like Bruno Latour's actor network theory. All of these different ways of engaging or thinking about technologies, my sense is, can promote new ways of thinking about technologies, which can lead you to not only answer or respond to particular ethical questions, but also make sure that particular questions are asked as well, if that makes sense. So we have exactly 5 minutes for questions before it's time for trick-or-treating. Any questions you guys have?
So, the 4 categories you gave us on the slides, how we can categorize technology. Does everything fit into those 4, or are there miscellaneous that doesn't come to it?
You mean that McLuhan tetrad?
No. The 4 categories that you showed in that one slide.
Oh, you mean the embodiment,
Yeah.
alterity? Yeah. So Don Ides, big guy, written tons of books. Don Ides had a number of very successful students, some of whom are still very active in publishing. In fact, Don Ides might still be active in publishing. I checked recently. But one of his famous students is Peter Paul Verbeek, and he's written about cyborgian intentionality or ways technologies. So his example would be how does a pacemaker interact? We don't really embody a pacemaker. Maybe physically we embody the pacemaker, but there's something different going on there that maybe transcends embodiment. Right? Would you describe all pharmaceutical technologies as ones that we embody, or is there something different going on there? So there's students who've come up with other kind of categories, you could say, particularly as new technologies have come to the forefront. And then what's also apparent is there are some technologies that are very simple, right? Like a hammer is a great example for an embodiment technology. But when you start thinking about a technology like an iPhone, you're like, well, gosh, this thing does so many different things. It doesn't really sit with any one category, which is actually okay. But if we want to explore the ethics of an iPhone, then we can ask about how might we embody it? How might it act as an other to us, right? How might it be in the background of our lives, right? Think about like location services, right? And technologies, right? Where, you know, most parents, my sense is a lot of parents are equipping their kids with a cell phone these days in high school, if not earlier, right? And what's fascinating is, by and large, parents know now where their kids are all the time, right? They just say, you know, use the Find My Friends app or whatever, and oh, there's my kid, they're in school, right? Or what are they doing over there? They're supposed to be coming home right after, right? That changes the relationship of parents and kids. That changes that sense of independence that you have, right? I mean, gosh, when we were younger, if you wanted to go out to the mall or go out to a movie and you were getting a ride from your parents, you make sure you have a quarter in your pocket to phone for a ride when you're done, right? Like, it is a very different world, right? And as a result, it's not uncommon to now see parents who really struggle with their kids going to the park even on their own, because they're so used to knowing where they are at all times. So now they put ear tags on them, right? Which is interesting, right? So I guess what I'm trying to say is, you know, there are many technologies that fit into more than one category, and there's clearly more categories that you could write about. And there's actually some nice post-phenomenology literature where someone's taken a technology and said, here's how this technology resists any of these categories. We should think up a new one, and this is my argument for it. Any other questions? That's a good one. That's all right, it's 3:20. Thanks guys for having me. If you want to reach out to me after class because you do have any questions, just feel free to send me an email, and I'll make sure I'll send Kim the slides for both topics again.
Great. Okay, thank you very, very much.